20 million barrels of oil pass through a strip of water 21 miles wide every single day. That is not a metaphor. That is the margin between the global economy functioning and it beginning to break. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched Operation Epic Fury. The opening strike killed Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. Within hours, Iran's response was not a missile barrage or a cyber attack. It was something quieter and in many ways more devastating. Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz. What followed was the largest energy disruption the world had seen since the 1970s oil embargo. Not a disruption caused by politics or negotiation or the threat of force, but by actual, enforced blockade. Daily ship crossings through the strait collapsed from 138 to 3. Oil surged past $126 per barrel. Analysts who had spent careers studying energy markets said, quietly, that they had never seen anything quite like it. To understand why this mattered, you have to understand what the strait actually is. It is not just a shipping lane. It is the single choke point through which the oil of Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Iraq, and Iran itself must pass to reach the world. There is no pipeline that replaces it at scale. There is no alternative route that absorbs the volume. When the strait closes, the global economy does not reroute. It holds its breath. Iran knew this. They had known it for 40 years. The closure of the strait was not improvised in the hours after Khamenei's death. It was the culmination of 4 decades of doctrine, construction, and preparation, a strategy built on one central premise, that the cost of reopening the strait would always be higher than the cost of closing it. The enforcement of the blockade rested on 3 interlocking tools, each designed to compound the others. The first was the Maham limpet mine, small, magnetic, laid silently in the dark by divers and submarines. You cannot bomb a minefield from altitude. Clearing it requires ships, divers, time, and exposure to the next layer of the trap. The second layer was the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy's fleet of fast attack boats, hundreds of them, operating in swarm configurations, coordinated, low profile, and difficult to track at speed. In the first weeks of the blockade, 21 confirmed attacks on merchant vessels were recorded. Not warnings, attacks. The message to commercial shipping was unambiguous: attempt the crossing and accept the risk. But the third layer is the one that made military planners in Washington and Tel Aviv go quiet. Hidden inside hardened mountain bunkers along Iran's coastline, structures buried under rock and thick reinforced concrete, built over decades and designed to survive conventional airstrikes, Iran had positioned shore-launched anti-ship cruise missiles, the Nors, the Qatar, and the long-range Abu Mahdi, capable of hitting a target 1,000 kilometers away. These bunkers were considered, by most serious military analysts, to be practically immune to conventional attack. The concrete alone ran to more than 20 feet in some locations. The surrounding rock added another layer that no standard munition could reliably penetrate. Iran had built its ultimate leverage on this assumption that even a superpower, even with the most advanced air force on Earth, could not reach inside the mountain. This was Iran's nuclear option short of a nuclear weapon, not a bomb, not a missile that could be intercepted or a regime that could be pressured. A physical structure buried in the earth that held the global energy supply hostage from inside geography itself. The economics moved faster than the diplomacy. War risk insurance premiums for a single transit of the strait jumped from 0.125% to 0.4% almost overnight. an additional $250,000 per supertanker. Then, on March 5th, underwriters stopped offering coverage entirely. The strait was not just closed by force, it was closed by mathematics, by the cold calculation of risk that governs every decision a shipping company, an insurer, and a port authority makes. When the math says do not go, the ships do not go. 22 countries pledged support for restoring freedom of navigation. Statements were issued, commitments were made, and still the crossing count sat at 3 per day. Iran had spent 40 years building a trap, and for several weeks in early 2026, the trap was working exactly as designed. The question that no one could yet answer, the question that sat at the center of every intelligence briefing, every command meeting, every conversation between Washington and its allies, was the one Iran had spent 4 decades making as difficult as possible to answer yes to. Could the bunkers actually be destroyed? On March 17th, the United States Central Command made an announcement that most people outside the defense community did not fully understand. They said that a weapon called the GBU-72 Advanced 5,000-pound penetrator had been used in combat for the first time. The name meant nothing to most viewers. What it meant in practice was this: the bunkers Iran had spent 40 years building, the structures buried under 20 feet of reinforced concrete and hundreds of feet of rock, the foundations of the entire blockade strategy had been opened like envelopes. The engineering of the GBU-72 is worth a moment of attention because it explains something that seemed impossible. The bomb weighs 5,000 pounds. Its body is elongated steel, hardened and shaped not to explode on contact, but to penetrate, to drill through 100 feet of compacted earth or more than 20 feet of reinforced concrete before the warhead detonates. The destruction happens from the inside. The structure does not absorb the blast. It becomes the blast chamber. Multiple GBU-72s struck the hardened coastal caves along Iran's coastline that housed its anti-ship missile arsenal. CENTCOM's damage assessment the following morning reported Iran's missile stockpile reduced by 90% in a single night. 90%. One night. 40 years of construction answered in hours. The broader air campaign had been running for weeks before that. B-2 stealth bombers, flying 37-hour round-trip missions from the continental United States, undetectable by radar at any point in the journey, had been systematically working through Iran's military infrastructure. B-1B Lancers struck anti-ship weapon depots. B-52s targeted drone production facilities and torpedo manufacturing sites. By the end of Week 5, the numbers were staggering in their scale. Over 11,000 targets struck, 11,000 sorties flown, more than 150 Iranian vessels damaged or destroyed. This was not a punitive raid. This was the deliberate, methodical erasure of a military architecture. But air power alone could not reopen the strait. And this is where the campaign's second phase revealed something important about how modern warfare actually works. The fast attack boats were still there. Destroying the bunkers eliminated the missile threat overhead, but the surface of the water remained contested. Hundreds of small, fast, maneuverable craft, crewed by IRGC personnel trained for exactly this kind of attrition, swarming, dispersing, attacking, retreating. Conventional naval responses struggle against swarm tactics because the math is unfavorable. A missile that costs hundreds of thousands of dollars should not be used to sink a speedboat. The cost asymmetry is the entire point of the strategy. The answer came from 2 directions simultaneously. The first was the A-10 Warthog, a ground attack aircraft designed in the 1970s that the U.S. Air Force has repeatedly tried to retire and repeatedly been unable to replace for exactly these situations. It's GAU-8. Avenger rotary cannon fires 3,900 rounds per minute. Against a small fiberglass boat moving at speed across open water, this is overwhelming and economical force. The A-10 can fly low and slow, loitering over a target zone for extended periods, which matters enormously when the threat is dispersed and intermittent rather than fixed and massed. AH-64 Apache attack helicopters coordinated alongside them, extending the coverage and tightening the response time. The second answer was something newer, and its long-term implications reach well beyond this conflict. The Garce, a 5-meter autonomous drone speedboat, entered operational deployment in the strait. It requires no crew. It can patrol for more than 450 continuous hours. It can be configured for surveillance, for interdiction, or converted into a direct attack vessel. Here, in the contested waters of the Strait of Hormuz, the United States deployed autonomous maritime systems against an adversary whose entire doctrine was built around using cheap, expendable, crewed fast boats as the asymmetric counter to expensive American platforms. The Gar-C is cheaper than the boats it hunts. The asymmetry, for the first time, ran in the other direction. Then came the strike that, more than any single event, ended the blockade as a functioning military operation. Israel, operating on intelligence that U.S. forces had developed, killed Admiral Alireza Tangsiri, the commander of the IRGC Navy, the architect of the fast boat swarm doctrine, the man who had personally overseen the blockade's enforcement, in a nighttime strike on Bandar Abbas. Decapitation is a word used carefully in military analysis. In this case, it was literal and it was strategic simultaneously. U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth's summary the following morning was blunt to the point of clinical. Iran no longer has a navy or a naval commander. Over 120 Iranian naval vessels had been destroyed or incapacitated. The Noor bunker, silent. The Qatar, collapsed. The Abu Mahdi missile system, neutralized before it could be fired at range. The swarm boats, hunted by autonomous systems that did not tire, did not flinch, and did not need to be rotated home. The architecture of Iran's 40-year deterrent strategy had not been degraded or disrupted. It had been structurally dismantled inside of 5 weeks. The strait was not yet open. The mines remained. The risk calculations of the insurance markets had not yet reversed. And somewhere in the wreckage of Iran's military command, decisions were being made about what came next. What the world would inherit from those decisions, economically, strategically, and in terms of how wars will be fought going forward, is where this story gets complicated. The guns were not yet silent when the bills started arriving. Oil had climbed 40% above its pre-conflict level. Not a spike caused by speculation or rumor. A repricing caused by the physical reality that 1/5 of the world's seaborne oil supply had been interrupted for weeks. Aluminum markets buckled because aluminum smelting is energy intensive, and energy had become dramatically more expensive almost overnight. Fertilizer prices surged, which means food prices will follow on a lag of months, in ways that will hit the poorest import-dependent economies hardest and most invisibly. Iranian drones struck Qatar's LNG export hub, sending tremors through global natural gas supply chains. Even helium, the unglamorous, indispensable gas used in semiconductors and medical imaging and fiber optics, was disrupted, because a meaningful share of global helium moves through infrastructure that sits inside the blast radius of this conflict. War risk insurance premiums, which had already jumped from 0.125 to 0.4% per transit before being withdrawn entirely on March 5th, did not immediately recover when the shooting slowed. Insurance markets price expectation, not just current reality. The expectation that the strait could be closed again, that the precedent had now been set and could be repeated by another actor in another crisis at another moment. That expectation was now permanently embedded in the mathematics of every shipping route that touches the Persian Gulf. The coalition that assembled around the effort to reopen the strait was, on paper, substantial. 22 countries pledged support. The United Kingdom deployed autonomous mine-hunting drones alongside the HMS Dragon. On March 19th, a joint statement from the UK, France, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, Japan, and Canada committed formally to restoring safe passage, a moment of coordinated multilateral resolve that in a different political climate might have been unremarkable. In this one, it was notable precisely because it was hard to achieve. Multiple allies had initially declined Donald Trump's direct call for warships. He said so publicly, and the friction was real. The coalition held, but it held with visible strain, a reminder that the architecture of Western military cooperation is not a machine that runs automatically. It requires political maintenance, and that maintenance is becoming more expensive precisely as the crises requiring it become more frequent. Here is what the recovery actually looked like on the water. Daily crossings through the strait climbed from 3 back to roughly 15 by the end of March. Meaningful progress, but still a fraction of the 138 that represented normal traffic. Analysts projected 60 to 70% of normal volume returning within weeks, contingent on the pace of mine clearance. That pace is not fast. Mine clearance is slow, dangerous, methodical work that cannot be accelerated by firepower or political will. Every day that a sweeper vessel works the strait is a day the global shipping industry watches and waits and prices in the remaining uncertainty. Iran's drone production capacity was degraded but not eliminated. Mobile missile launchers, by their nature harder to locate and fix than bunker installations, survived the campaign in unknown numbers. The strait was functionally reopening. It was not functionally secured. And this is where the analysis has to be precise, because the temptation after a military success of this scale is to read it as conclusive. It was not conclusive. What it was, and this distinction matters, was definitive. It definitively answered the question that Iran's 40-year doctrine had depended on leaving unanswered. The bunkers could be destroyed. The swarm boats could be countered at acceptable cost. The commander could be reached. The leverage, it turned out, was not indestructible. It was just expensive to destroy. And the United States, in the spring of 2026, chose to pay the price. What military historians and defense planners will study from this conflict is not any single weapon or any single strike. It is the combination. Stealth air power that cannot be tracked or intercepted, delivering precision munitions accurate to within meters. Bunker-busting bombs that made geography itself an unreliable form of protection. Autonomous maritime systems that inverted the cost calculus of asymmetric naval warfare. Targeted decapitation that removed the human architecture of command faster than it could be replaced. None of these elements was new in isolation. What was new was their synchronized application across domains simultaneously, air, surface, subsurface, and intelligence, with a speed and precision that gave the defending force no interval in which to adapt. Iran's doctrine was built for a different era. It was built on the assumption that asymmetric tools, cheap drones, mines, fast boats, dispersed launchers, would exhaust a technologically superior adversary through attrition and cost imposition. That doctrine met in the GARC drone boat and the GBU-72 and the Apache Warthog coordination over the strait, an adversary that had built asymmetric counters to asymmetric threats. The cost imposition ran both ways, and the United States had deeper pockets. The deeper lesson is not about hardware, it is about assumptions. Iran's deterrent was real. The bunkers were genuinely hard to destroy. The swarm tactics were genuinely difficult to counter economically. The strait was genuinely the margin between global stability and global disruption. Every piece of that calculation was correct, right up until the moment it wasn't. The assumption that the cost of dismantling the deterrent would always exceed the cost of tolerating it had held for 4 decades. In 2026, that assumption was tested by an adversary willing to pay the price, equipped with tools precise enough to pay it efficiently, and it failed. For every other state that has constructed its security doctrine around a geographic choke point, a hardened installation, or an asymmetric capability designed to be too costly to confront, that failure will be studied carefully. The strait is reopening. The lesson is only beginning to be absorbed.